the Clinton administration and dual containment. In early 1993, just as the Clinton administration was coming to power, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and his foreign minister Shimon Peres started claiming that Iran was a growing threat to both Israel and the United States. Israeli leaders portrayed Iran as a dangerous adversary, in part because they saw it as a way of fostering closer relations between Jerusalem and Washington now that the Soviet threat had disappeared. The hope was that the United States would see Israel as a bulwark against Iranian expansionism, much the way Israel had been treated as a bulwark against Soviet influence in the Middle East. Israel was also justifiably concerned about Iran's renewed interest in developing a sophisticated nuclear program. The Washington Post reported in mid-March 1993 that, across the Israeli political spectrum, there is a conviction that American public opinion and political leaders need to be further convinced of the urgency of restraining Iran, and that the United States is the only global power capable of doing so. The Clinton administration responded to Israel's entreaties by adopting the policy of dual containment, as we have discussed. Not only was the policy first enunciated at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy by Martin Indyk, but Robert Pelletreau, Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs at the time, told Trita Parsi that the policy was essentially a copy of an Israeli proposal. Kenneth Pollack of Brookings Saban Center also notes that Jerusalem was one of the few places on earth where dual containment was not regularly misunderstood. The new policy called for the United States to abandon its traditional strategy of acting as an offshore balancer in the Persian Gulf and instead station a substantial number of troops in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia for the purpose of containing both Iran and Iraq. In fact, the policy was designed to do more than just contain Iran. It also aimed to cause dramatic changes in Iran's behavior. Among its goals was forcing Iran to stop supporting terrorists and to abandon its nuclear program. Israel's concerns notwithstanding, there was no good reason for the United States to adopt a hardline policy toward Iran in the early 1990s. If anything, just the opposite was the case. Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who became Iran's president in 1989, was committed to improving relations with Washington, and Iran, which had recently suffered through a devastating war with Iraq, was hardly a military threat to the United States. In the early 1990s, in fact, American leaders were much more concerned about Saddam Hussein, against whom the United States had just fought a war. Plus, Iran's nuclear program had barely gotten off the ground in 1993. Few voices in Washington were calling for tougher policies against Iran before Israel began clamoring for a more confrontational policy. And dual containment was widely criticized when it was first announced. By the mid-1990s, there was growing dissatisfaction with dual containment because it forced the United States to maintain hostile relations with two countries that disliked each other intensely, and it left Washington pretty much alone to handle the demanding task of keeping them in line. Consequently, pressure began to build in the United States to think about engaging Iran rather than confronting it. At the same time, however, Rabin was under pressure in Israel to get the Clinton administration to toughen up the policy. Rabin's critics felt that dual containment had no real teeth because it had done little to stop the substantial economic intercourse between Iran and the United States. Israel and the lobby, especially the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, mobilized to save dual containment and to close the loopholes that allowed American companies to trade and invest in Iran. In mid-1994, Parsi reports, at the behest of the Israeli government, Aipac drafted and circulated a 74-page paper in Washington arguing that Iran was not only a threat to Israel, but also to the United States and the West. According to Pollock, the right, Aipac, the Israelis were all screaming for new sanctions on Iran. The Clinton administration was willing to go along, largely because it was focusing on the Oslo peace process and wanted to make sure that Israel felt secure and that Iran, a potential spoiler, did not derail the process. Aipac laid out its basic game plan in April 1995 when it issued a report titled Comprehensive U.S. Sanctions Against Iran, a Plan for Action. By that point, however, steps were already being taken to tighten the economic noose around Iran's neck. Senator Alphonse D'Amato, Republican New York, with, according to Pollock, some help from the Israelis, introduced legislation in January 1995 to end all economic links between the United States and Iran. The Clinton administration opposed the legislation at first, and it stalled in Congress. But 2 months later, groups in the lobby achieved their first success after Iran chose Conoco, an American oil company, to develop the Syri oil fields. Iran deliberately selected Conoco over several other foreign bidders in order to signal its interest in improving relations with the United States. But this friendly overture went nowhere because Clinton killed the deal on March 14. 1 day later, he issued an executive order banning American companies from helping Iran develop its oil fields. Clinton later said that one of the most effective opponents of the Conoco deal was Edgar Bronfman Sr., the powerful former head of the World Jewish Congress. Aipac also played a key role in scuttling that deal. On May 6, the president issued a second executive order banning all trade and financial investments with Iran, which he labeled an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. Clinton had actually announced that he was going to take that step 1 week earlier in a speech to the World Jewish Congress. His decision to nix the Conoco deal and issue those 2 executive orders was, notes Pollock, a major demonstration of our support for Israel. Ironically, although Israel lay behind the American decision to cut economic ties to Iran, Israel did not pass any laws barring Israeli-Iranian trade, and Israelis continued to purchase Iranian goods through third parties. But those executive orders were not enough for the lobby, because executive orders could be quickly reversed if Clinton ever changed his mind. A.M. Rosenthal, a strong defender of Israel, made this point in a New York Times column in which he criticized the Conoco deal. The only problem with executive orders is that what the president giveth he can cancelleth. In response to this potential problem, Trita Parsi reports that, on its own initiative, Aipac revised the bill that Senator D'Amato had introduced in January 1995 and convinced the New York senator to reintroduce it in 1996 with Aipac's proposed changes. The new bill, which eventually became the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, imposed sanctions on any foreign companies investing more than $40 million to develop petroleum resources in Iran or Libya. Although the proposed legislation infuriated America's European allies, the House passed it by a vote of 415 to none on June 19, 1996, and the Senate passed it by unanimous consent 1 month later. Clinton signed the bill on August 5, even though there was significant opposition to the new legislation throughout the administration. Indeed, Kenneth Pollock writes that much of the executive branch hated the D'Amato bill. In fact, for many, hated was too mild a word. However, many of President Clinton's domestic policy advisers thought it would be sheer stupidity for the White House not to endorse the bill. Since Clinton was up for re-election in 3 months, they were probably right. As Zev Schiff, the military correspondent for Haaretz, noted at the time, Israel is but a tiny element in the big scheme, but one should not conclude that it cannot influence those within the Beltway. Similarly, James Schlesinger, who has held a number of cabinet-level positions in different administrations, remarked in the wake of these sanctions, "It is scarcely possible to overstate the influence of Israel supporters on our policies in the Middle East." The Conoco episode casts further doubt on the oft-repeated claim that the oil lobby is the real hidden hand behind U.S. Middle East policy. In this case, an American oil company wanted to deal with Iran, and Iran wanted to do business with it. The oil industry was opposed to overturning the Conoco deal, and it also opposed the legislation to impose sanctions on Iran. As noted in Chapter 4, Dick Cheney, a prominent advocate of confronting Iran today, publicly opposed the U.S. sanctions program when he was president of the oil services company Halliburton in the 1990s. But oil interests were steamrolled by Aipac on every decision. These outcomes provide more evidence of how little influence the oil companies have on U.S. Middle East policy when compared to Israel and the lobby. The American posture continued to harden even as new opportunities for engagement became apparent. On May 23, 1997, Mohammad Khatami was elected president of Iran. He was even more enthusiastic than his predecessor about improving relations with the West, and the United States in particular. He made conciliatory remarks in his inaugural speech on August 4 and in his first press conference on December 14. Most important, he went out of his way in a lengthy CNN interview on January 7, 1998, to express his respect for the great American people and their great civilization. He also made it clear that Iran did not aim to destroy or undermine the American government, and that he regretted the infamous takeover of the U.S. Embassy in 1979. Recognizing the existing hostility between Tehran and Washington, he called for a crack in this wall of mistrust to prepare for a change and create an opportunity to study a new situation. Furthermore, Khatami did not rule out the possibility of an Israeli state in historic Palestine and declared that terrorism should be condemned in all its forms and manifestations. He also denounced terrorism against Israelis, while noting that supporting peoples who fight for the liberation of their land is not, in my opinion, supporting terrorism. This caveat notwithstanding, Khatami's remarks were still a marked shift in Iran's position, and other Iranian spokesmen soon echoed Iran's willingness to accept Israel if it reached an agreement with the Palestinians. In the wake of Khatami's conciliatory comments, the Clinton administration, after checking with Israel and key figures in Congress, made a number of small gestures to improve relations between Iran and the United States. Clinton and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright made contrite remarks about past Western conduct, and the United States eased visa restrictions on travel between the two countries. Even Martin Indyk, the architect of dual containment, who was then serving as U.S. ambassador to Israel, told reporters that the United States has made it clear repeatedly that we have nothing against an Islamic government in Iran. We are ready for a dialogue. But the commercial restrictions remained in force, and dual containment continued for the rest of Clinton's second term. This failure to alter course was partly due to hardliners inside Iran who were strongly opposed to Khatami's plans to engage with the Great Satan. But Israel and its supporters in the United States also played an important role in discouraging an American-Iranian rapprochement. For starters, The lobby had been largely responsible for developing and sustaining dual containment in the years before Khatami came to power in 1997. That policy, of course, helped poison relations between Tehran and Washington, which in turn increased the political power of the Iranian politicians who opposed Iran's new and more moderate leader. Furthermore, as soon as it became clear in mid-December 1997 that Khatami was calling for better relations with America, Israeli officials moved to thwart his initiative. Haaretz reported that Israel has expressed its concern to Washington at reports of an impending change of policy by the United States towards Iran, adding that Prime Minister Netanyahu has asked Aipac to act vigorously in Congress to prevent such a policy shift. Aipac did as Netanyahu asked. According to Gary Sick, one of America's leading experts on Iran, the gradual improvement of U.S.-Iran relations after the election of Khatami was not reflected in Aipac's positions. In fact, by early 1999, only Aipac, the Iranian monarchists in exile, and the terrorist Mojahedin-e-Khalq persisted in their relentless insistence that little or nothing had changed in Iran. Even after the Israeli ambassador to the United States had said in the spring of 2000 that it would be acceptable for Clinton to allow certain food and medical supplies to be exported to Iran, Aipac still campaigned against the legislation. Aipac did not oppose Clinton's decision to lift the ban on caviar, Persian rugs, and pistachios imported from Iran, but the Anti-Defamation League and the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations did. Clinton ultimately got his way in both cases, mainly because each involved small amounts of trade and little controversy. But the United States did not make a serious effort to grasp the hand that Khatami had tentatively extended. It made good sense for the United States to engage Iran during the 1990s and attempt to improve relations between the two countries. Dual containment, as Brent Scowcroft observed, was a nutty idea. Israeli leaders, however, believed that it was in Israel's interest to prevent President Clinton from pursuing engagement, even if that more aggressive policy was not in America's national interest. Ephraim Snee, one of Israel's leading hawks on Iran, put the point succinctly. "We were against it, United States-Iran dialogue, because the interest of the U.S. did not coincide with ours." The lobby followed Israel's lead. The Bush administration and regime change. As discussed in Chapter 8, the attacks on September 11, 2001 led President Bush to abandon dual containment and pursue the even more ambitious strategy of regional transformation. The American military would now be used to topple hostile regimes across the Middle East. From Israel's perspective, Iran was ideally suited to be the first target on the Bush administration's hit list. Since the early 1990s, Israeli leaders have tended to portray Iran as their most dangerous enemy because it is the adversary most likely to acquire nuclear weapons. As Israeli Defense Minister Binyamin Ben-Elazar remarked 1 year before the Iraq War, "Iraq is a problem, but you should understand, if you ask me, today Iran is more dangerous than Iraq." Nevertheless, Sharon and his lieutenants recognized by early 2002 that the United States was determined to confront Iraq first and deal with Iran after Saddam had been removed from power. They raised no serious objections to this ordering of the agenda, although they kept reminding the Bush administration that it had to deal with Iran as soon as it finished the job in Baghdad. Sharon began publicly pushing the United States to confront Iran in November 2002 in an interview with the Times of London. describing Iran as the center of world terror and bent on acquiring nuclear weapons. He declared that the Bush administration should put the strong arm on Iran the day after it conquered Iraq. In late April 2003, after the fall of Baghdad, Haaretz reported that the Israeli ambassador in Washington was now calling for regime change in Iran. The overthrow of Saddam, he noted, was not enough. In his words, America has to follow through. We still have great threats of that magnitude coming from Syria, coming from Iran. 10 days later, the New York Times reported that Washington was growing increasingly concerned about Iran's nuclear ambitions, and that there is a lot of hammering from the Israelis for us to take this problem seriously. Shimon Peres then published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal on June 25, titled, "We Must Unite to Prevent an Ayatollah Nuke." His description of the Iranian threat sounded just like his earlier description of the threat from Saddam, even including a ritual reference to the lessons of appeasement in the 1930s. Iran, he emphasized, must be told in no uncertain terms that the United States and Israel will not tolerate it going nuclear. The neoconservatives also lost no time in making the case for regime change in Tehran. In late May 2003, Interpress Service reported that the neocons' efforts to now focus U.S. attention on regime change in Iran have become much more intense since early May and have already borne substantial fruit. In early June, according to the Forward, neoconservatives inside and outside the administration have been urging an active effort to promote regime change in Tehran. Reports of possible covert actions have surfaced in recent weeks. As usual, there was a bevy of articles by prominent neoconservatives, essentially the same people who had helped push the war in Iraq, making the case for going after Iran. William Crystal wrote in the Weekly Standard on May 12 that the liberation of Iraq was the first great battle for the future of the Middle East, but the next great battle, not, we hope, a military battle, will be for Iran. Michael Ledeen, one of the leading hawks on Iran, wrote in the National Review Online on April 4, "There is no more time for diplomatic solutions. We will have to deal with the terror masters, here and now. Iran, at least, offers us the possibility of a memorable victory, because the Iranian people openly loathe the regime and will enthusiastically combat it, if only the United States supports them in their just struggle." Other pundits offering similar views at this time include Daniel Pipes of the Middle East Forum and YNEP's Patrick Clausen, who published a piece in the Jerusalem Post on May 21 titled, "Turn Up the Pressure on Iran." They called for the Bush administration to support the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, a group based in Iraq that is bent on overthrowing the regime in Tehran, but that the U.S. government has designated a terrorist organization. Lawrence Kaplan argued in the New Republic on June 9 that the United States needed to get tougher with Iran over its nuclear programs, which he feared were farther along than most American policymakers recognized. On May 6, the American Enterprise Institute co-sponsored an all-day conference on the future of Iran with two other pro-Israel organizations, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and the Hudson Institute. The speakers were all strong supporters of Israel like Bernard Lewis, Senator Sam Brownback, Uri Lubrani, senior advisor to the IDF and former Israeli government coordinator for southern Lebanon, Morris Amatei from the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs and former executive director of Aipac, Michael Ledeen, Ruel Mark Jurek from the AEI, and Meirav Wormser from the Hudson Institute. The main question on the table was the obvious one. What steps can the United States take to promote democratization and regime change in Iran? The answer was predictable. each of the speakers called for the United States to do much more to bring down the Islamic Republic and replace it with a democratic state. Toward this end, the lobby has struck up a close relationship with Reza Pahlavi, the late Shah of Iran's son. He is believed to have had personal meetings with both Sharon and Netanyahu, and he has extensive contacts with pro-Israel groups and individuals in the United States. The evolving relationship is much like the one that influential groups in the lobby had previously cultivated with Iraqi exile Ahmed Chalabi. Seemingly unaware that Pahlavi, like Chalabi, has little legitimacy in his homeland, pro-Israel groups have promoted his cause. In return, he makes it clear that if he were to come to power in Iran, he would make sure that his country has friendly relations with Israel. On May 19, 2003, Senator Sam Brownback announced that he planned to introduce legislation to fund opposition groups and promote democracy in Iran. The so-called Iran Democracy Act was backed not only by Iranian exiles, but also by Aipac, JINSA, and the Coalition for Democracy in Iran, whose founders included Morris Amitay of JINSA and Michael Ledeen of AEI. The bill was introduced in the House by Brad Sherman, Democrat, California, another dedicated supporter of Israel, and by late July it had been passed by both houses of Congress, although the funding was removed from the final legislation. The groups backing this legislation have emphasized that Iran is a major menace because it supports terrorism and is close to becoming a nuclear power. But they also have tried to blame Iran for some of the other problems that the United States has faced since the fall of Baghdad. Neoconservatives in the Pentagon suggested that Iran was harboring some of the al-Qaeda operatives who had attacked U.S. and other targets in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia on May 12, 2003. The Iranians denied this charge, and both the CIA and the State Department viewed the neoconservatives' accusations with considerable skepticism. The neoconservatives have also been among the most forceful proponents of the claim that Iran has been supporting attacks against American troops in Iraq. As Michael Ledeen wrote in April 2004, Iraq cannot be peaceful and secure so long as Tehran sends its terrorist cadres across the border. If Iran is contributing to militias in Iraq, it hardly proves that U.S. and Iranian interests are irreconcilable. Iran is not the main source of America's problems in Iraq, and the United States would be in deep trouble there even if Iran were doing nothing. Nor would it be surprising if Iran were acting in this way. After all, the world's most powerful country has invaded two of Iran's neighbors while simultaneously declaring that Tehran is part of the axis of evil. The U.S. Congress has passed a law calling for regime change in Iran, and the Bush administration has funded Iranian exile groups and hinted on several occasions that it might strike Iran with military force. Wouldn't any country facing this sort of threat do whatever it could to protect itself, including using its influence with different Iraqi factions and possibly sending them various forms of aid? If a hostile power conquered Canada or Mexico and tried to set up a sympathetic government there, wouldn't the United States try to complicate that hostile power's efforts and ensure an outcome more favorable to U.S. interests? Americans have good reason to resent Iran's influence in Iraq, but they should hardly be surprised by it or see it as evidence of unremitting Iranian hostility. It is also worth noting that deep antipathy did not prevent the U.S. government from engaging Soviet leaders throughout the Cold War, even when Moscow was providing millions of dollars worth of military aid to North Vietnam, which used this assistance to kill thousands of American soldiers. Rising to Israel's defense. Israel and the lobby have been remarkably successful at convincing Bush and other leading American politicians that a nuclear-armed Iran is an unacceptable threat to Israel and that it is the responsibility of the United States to prevent that threat from increasing. In fact, there is some evidence that some individuals in the lobby think they have been too successful for Israel's own good. The president's current rhetoric clearly reflects Israel's preferred approach toward Iran, as is apparent from a speech he gave in Cleveland on March 20, 2006. The threat from Iran, he said, is of course their stated objective to destroy our strong ally Israel. That's a threat, a serious threat. I made it clear, I'll make it clear again, that we will use military might to protect our ally Israel. Bush's comments were consistent with his previous statements. He said a month earlier in an interview with Reuters that we will rise to Israel's defense if need be. Moreover, most of the 2008 presidential candidates, Democrats and Republicans alike, appear to agree with the president. In April 2007, for example, Senator John McCain said explicitly that he agreed with Bush that the United States had a responsibility to protect Israel from Iran and to make sure that Iran did not get nuclear weapons that might threaten Israel. He reiterated that claim in a May 2007 interview with the Jerusalem Post, and fellow candidates Barack Obama, Mitt Romney, Bill Richardson, and Sam Brownback offered similar comments as well. Bush's enthusiasm for defining Iran as a mortal threat to Israel but not the United States, coupled with his stated commitment to go to war against Iran for Israel's benefit, has set off alarm bells in various parts of the lobby. In the spring of 2006, The Forward reported, Jewish community leaders have urged the White House to refrain from publicly pledging to defend Israel against possible Iranian hostilities. The point is not that these leaders oppose the use of American power to protect Israel, but rather that they fear that Bush's public statements create an impression that the United States is considering a military option against Iran for the sake of Israel, and could lead to American Jews being blamed for any negative consequences of an American strike against Iran. As Malcolm Hoenlein, executive vice chairman of the Conference of Presidents, put it in April 2006, as much as we appreciate it, the question is whether it's beneficial to tie this to Israel. Israeli leaders share the same concern, as reflected in Prime Minister Olmert's comment later that spring that he hoped pro-Israel groups would maintain a low profile regarding Iran. We don't want it to be about Israel, he said, which was just the opposite of what the president was saying. Rhetoric aside, the Bush administration has worked assiduously to shut down Iran's nuclear program and has, in general, taken a more aggressive posture. It has imposed economic sanctions and threatened military strikes if Iran continues down the nuclear road. No option, American leaders are fond of saying, is off the table. James Bamford and Seymour Hersh have separately described how many of the same individuals who planned the Iraq War have devised the Pentagon's plans for a military campaign against Iran. For example, Douglas Feith, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy until August 2005, played a central role in developing plans for striking the Islamic Republic. There has also been close and largely unacknowledged cooperation with Israel, noted Hersh in early 2005. Defense Department civilians under the leadership of Douglas Feith have been working with Israeli planners and consultants to develop and refine potential nuclear, chemical weapons, and missile targets inside Iran. The Pentagon has also been conducting intelligence-gathering operations inside of Iran, and it has updated its contingency plans for a broader invasion of Iran. In January 2007, the Bush administration ratcheted up the military pressure on Iran in a number of ways. it arrested 5 Iranian officials in the Iraqi city of Erbil, who were in a building that the local Kurds and the Iranians considered a consular facility. The president then announced that he was sending an additional carrier battle group to the Persian Gulf, as well as Patriot anti-missile defense systems to defend the states in the Gulf Cooperation Council. At the same time, U.S. military officials in Baghdad were claiming that Iran was shipping key components of especially deadly roadside bombs into Iraq to be used against American troops. Both Stephen Hadley, the president's national security advisor, and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice made it clear that the administration had not ruled out the possibility that U.S. forces might cross into Iran in pursuit of Iranians trafficking in roadside bombs and other weapons. These confrontational moves notwithstanding, David Wormser, who advises Vice President Cheney on Middle East affairs, apparently felt that Rice and Hadley were too interested in negotiating with Iran, even if the diplomacy was backed up by threats, and not sufficiently committed to the military option. In spring 2007, Wormser gave a series of talks at the American Enterprise Institute and other conservative Washington think tanks, in which he said that the vice president was unhappy with the Secretary of State, as well as with President Bush, for pursuing diplomacy at all, and that Cheney was interested in working with Israel to come up with a military strategy to eliminate Iran's nuclear program that he could sell to the president. When Wormser's activities became public knowledge, Rice denied that there were differences within the administration on Iran and emphasized that the vice president fully supported the president's policy. While Washington has relied primarily on threats rather than negotiations in its dealings with Iran, the European Union has worked in the opposite direction and has attempted to find a diplomatic solution to the crisis. The EU3, Britain, France, and Germany, initiated negotiations with Tehran in early August 2003, and on October 21, Iran agreed to suspend its enrichment and reprocessing programs and to allow the International Atomic Energy Agency to conduct especially intrusive inspections. A year later, on November 15, 2004, Iran agreed to continue and extend its suspension to include all enrichment-related and reprocessing activities, and to begin negotiations with a view to reaching a mutually acceptable agreement on long-term arrangements. Efforts to reach a satisfactory deal failed, however, and Iran announced in August 2005 that it would resume enriching its uranium. The EU3 has continued talking with Iran, but to little avail. Although the United States was willing to allow the EU3 to try to halt Iran's nuclear program through negotiations, it had little enthusiasm for that bargaining process and was never strongly committed to making it work. In fact, by constantly threatening Iran and pushing the European negotiators to be as tough as possible with their Iranian counterparts, the Bush administration virtually guaranteed that the negotiations would lead nowhere. If there was any hope that diplomacy would succeed, the military threat had to be taken off the table. After diplomacy backed by threats failed to resolve the problem, the Bush administration began pushing hard in the fall of 2005 to get the UN Security Council to impose sanctions on Iran. It finally succeeded in late December 2006 when China and Russia agreed, after much foot-dragging, to a package of limited sanctions. In late March 2007, the Security Council approved a second set of sanctions on Iran over its refusal to shut down its nuclear enrichment facilities. These new sanctions, which were also limited in scope, included a ban on Iranian arms exports, travel restrictions on individuals associated with Iran's nuclear program, and freezing the assets of some individuals and organizations untouched by the first set of UN sanctions. Few experts believe that these measures will cause Iran to abandon its nuclear program, and few believe that the United States will be able to convince the Security Council to go along with the kind of tough sanctions that might work. But if UN sanctions are not the answer, what is? The alternatives. The Bush administration has three options left for halting Iran's nuclear program. It can try to coerce Tehran by markedly increasing the pressure on it with military measures short of war, tougher U.S. sanctions, and an anti-Iran coalition that includes Israel and the Arab states. It can try to eliminate it with military force, or it can make a serious attempt to strike a grand bargain that keeps Iran from developing nuclear weapons. Israel and most of the key organizations in the lobby, especially the Neoconservatives, favor the second option. But Israeli leaders and their American supporters are well aware that there is widespread opposition to attacking Iran inside and outside of the U.S. government, as well as in the international community, especially given the dire situation in Iraq. Moreover, it is clear that despite the rhetoric, President Bush has shown little enthusiasm for the military option, which is not to say that he would never strike Iran. Bush's plan for 2007 appears to call for ramping up the pressure on Iran in the hopes that it will cave in to U.S. demands to stop enriching uranium. As noted, the administration made a number of confrontational military moves in January that were aimed directly at Iran. And the President and Secretary of State Rice have also begun making a concerted effort to get the Arab states in the Middle East to line up with the United States and Israel against Iran. Against this backdrop, key groups in the lobby, which have been going along with Bush's policy for now, are mobilizing. The Forward reported on the eve of the March 2007 Aipac conference that the pro-Israel lobby is backing new congressional legislation that would toughen sanctions against Iran and target foreign entities doing business with the Islamic Republic. So far, this strategy has failed to produce results. The United States was heavily criticized by many Iraqis and even by the Kurds for arresting the 5 Iranians. And then, in March, the Iranians proved that two can play the game when they detained 15 British naval troops in the Persian Gulf, accusing them of trespassing in Iranian territorial waters. Meanwhile, Iran continues to develop its nuclear program and support Shia groups in Iraq. There is no evidence that sending additional carrier battle groups to the Gulf has had any effect on Tehran's behavior. Congress may enact much tougher sanctions, but the fact is that the administration is only mildly enthusiastic about taking that route, because this policy ends up imposing sanctions on allies that do business with Iran. It is a policy certain to strain U.S. relations with those allies, possibly undermining their willingness to help Washington put additional pressure on Iran. The administration's attempt to work closely with Arab states has made little progress, in good part because of America's continuing support of Israel over the Palestinians. In March, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia not only invited Iranian President Ahmadinejad to visit Riyadh, but also canceled a visit to the White House and condemned the U.S. occupation of Iraq as illegal. The director of the Center for Strategic Studies at the University of Jordan said that Abdullah was telling the U.S. they need to listen to their allies rather than imposing decisions on them and always taking Israel's side. As discussed in Chapter 7, Saudi Arabia was then pushing the Arab League to reissue its 2002 peace initiative for ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The United States, however, was pressuring the Saudis to change the proposal because Israel was unhappy with it. Secretary Rice condescendingly asked Arab countries to begin reaching out to Israel. This admonition angered the Saudis, especially Abdullah, who responded by lashing out at the American presence in Iraq. Coercion is unlikely to alter Tehran's calculations. This point is not lost on Israeli leaders and their allies in the United States, most of whom see a nuclear Iran as a mortal threat to Israel. For that reason, many have lobbied relentlessly not only to keep the military option on the table, but also to make the case that Iran is so dangerous that if it does not capitulate to Washington's demands, it will be necessary to use force. Consider what Prime Minister Ehud Olmert told a joint session of Congress on May 24, 2006. He likened Iran with nuclear weapons to the savagery of slavery, to the horrors of World War II, to the gulags of the communist bloc. He emphasized that a nuclear-armed Iran was not just a threat to Israel, but would put the security of the entire world in jeopardy. He made it clear that he expected the United States to play the key role in preventing this dark and gathering storm from casting its shadow over the world. A few months later, in November 2006, Olmert told a Newsweek interviewer that he did not believe that Iran would accept a compromise unless they have good reason to fear the consequences of not reaching a compromise. In other words, Iran must start to fear. By the spring of 2007, Olmert was intensifying the campaign to sell the military option. He told Germany's Focus magazine in late April, "It is impossible perhaps to destroy the entire nuclear program, but it would be possible to damage it in such a way that it would be set back years." Olmert estimated that it would take 10 days and would involve the firing of 1,000 Tomahawk cruise missiles. One Israeli general, however, questioned whether Bush had sufficient political power to attack Iran and suggested instead that Israel help him pave the way by lobbying the Democratic Party and U.S. newspaper editors to turn the Iranian issue into a bipartisan one. Israeli officials also warn they may take preemptive action themselves should Iran continue down the nuclear road. Besides sending a signal to Iran, these threats keep the pressure on Washington to solve the problem, because the United States does not want Israel to act on its own. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon warned in late 2005 that Israel, and not only Israel, cannot accept a nuclear Iran. "We have the ability to deal with this, and we're making all the necessary preparations to be ready for such a situation." London's Sunday Times reported in January 2007 that Israeli pilots were rehearsing a tactical nuclear strike against Iran's facilities. Although Israel officially denied the report, it did serve as a powerful reminder of the importance Israel attaches to this issue. As one Israeli defense analyst told the Associated Press, "It is possible that this was a leak done on purpose as deterrence to say, someone better hold us back before we do something crazy." Just in case this message was not getting through, Avigdor Lieberman, the deputy prime minister, told Der Spiegel in February 2007 that if the international community does not solve the problem, Israel may have to act alone. Some in the lobby have moved beyond vague calls for regime change and begun to make the case that a nuclear-armed Iran is intolerable, and the United States must be prepared to use force to deal with the problem. Neoconservative pundits have been especially outspoken about the threat from Iran and the need to use force, or at least threaten it, to bring Iran to heel. The essence of their perspective is captured in the headline of an op-ed that Michael Rubin of the American Enterprise Institute published in the New York Daily News on October 3, 2006. "To end Iraq standoff, plan for war." Joshua Moravchik, who is also at the AEI, declared a month later that President Bush will need to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities before leaving office. It is all but inconceivable that Iran will accept any peaceful inducements to abandon its drive for the bomb. Similarly, Richard Pearl said approvingly in January 2007 that, "I have no doubt that if it becomes apparent to President Bush that during his term Iran will achieve nuclear weapons, he will not hesitate to order a strike." Finally, Norman Podhoretz published a widely discussed article on May 30, 2007, in the online version of the Wall Street Journal titled, "The Case for Bombing Iran. I Hope and Pray that Bush Will Do It." Aipac has also played a central role in publicizing the threat from Iran and pushing forward the military option. Its annual conference for the past 2 years has put the Iran issue up in bright lights and emphasized the imperative of ending its nuclear program. Indeed, John Hagee, who heads Christians United for Israel, was invited to address the 2007 conference. Hagee had told the Jerusalem Post in 2006 that, "I would hope the United States would join Israel in a military preemptive strike to take out the nuclear capability of Iran for the salvation of Western civilization." He did not disappoint the attendees at the March 2007 conference, telling them, "It is 1938, Iran is Germany, and Ahmadinejad is the new Hitler. We must stop Iran's nuclear threat and stand boldly with Israel." He received multiple standing ovations. By contrast, the New York Post reports that Senator Hillary Clinton drew grumbles the previous month when she suggested to an Aipac audience that it might make sense to engage with Iran before employing stronger measures. Perhaps the best evidence of Aipac's influence on U.S. policy toward Iran was revealed in mid-March 2007, when Congress was attempting to attach a provision to a Pentagon spending bill that would have required President Bush to get its approval before attacking Iran. In light of what has happened in the Iraq War, this was a popular measure on Capitol Hill and appeared likely to gain approval. It was also consistent with Congress's constitutional authority. But Aipac was firmly opposed because it saw the legislation as effectively taking the military option against Iran off the table. It went to work in the halls of Congress, and with the help of a handful of pro-Israel representatives, Gary Ackerman, Elliot Engel, and Shelley Berkeley, Democrat Nevada, the provision was removed from the spending bill. 1 month later, when Congressman Michael Capuano, Democrat Massachusetts, was asked why the language on Iran was stripped out of the bill, he answered with one word, Aipac. Congressman Dennis Kucinich, Democrat Ohio, offered the same assessment. Despite the commitment that Israel and some in the lobby have to pushing the military option against Iran, it is widely recognized that threatening to use force against Iran is counterproductive, and actually attacking that country's nuclear facilities would have disastrous consequences. It would further destabilize the Middle East and cause Iran to lash out at the United States and its allies. The last thing that Washington needs at this point is another war against an Islamic country. The American military is already bogged down in Baghdad, and Iran has substantially more territory and people than Iraq. Furthermore, Iran would almost certainly not give up its nuclear program, but would redouble its efforts to rebuild it, as Iraq did after Israel destroyed its incipient nuclear capability in 1981. It is unsurprising that Charles Kupchan, an expert on European security issues, says, "I have yet to find a European policymaker who thinks war is preferable to a nuclear Iran." In fact, Israel is the only country in the world where a substantial number of people advocate the military option against Iran if it does not end its nuclear program. perhaps as much as 71% of the Israeli population, according to a May 2007 poll. Similarly, the core organizations in the lobby are the only significant groups in the United States that favor going to war against the Islamic Republic. In early 2007, when retired General Wesley Clark was asked why the Bush administration seemed headed for war with Iran, he answered, "You just have to read what's in the Israeli press. The Jewish community is divided, but there is so much pressure being channeled from the New York money people to the office seekers." Clark was immediately smeared as an anti-Semite for suggesting that Israel and some American Jews were pushing the United States toward war with Iran. But as journalist Matthew Iglesias pointed out, everything Clark said is true. What's more, everybody knows it's true. Even more pointedly, former UN weapons inspector turned author Scott Ritter said in his 2006 book Target Iran, "Let there be no doubt. If there is an American war with Iran, it is a war that was made in Israel and nowhere else." In short, if Israel and the lobby were not pressing this case, there would be little serious discussion, inside or outside the Beltway, about attacking Iran. The least bad option. As noted earlier, the best option available to the Bush administration is to remove the threat of force and attempt to reach a comprehensive agreement with Iran. It is difficult to say whether this strategy would work, but there is good reason to think that it might have worked in the past and might even work in the future. Iran signaled on 2 separate occasions since 9/11 that it was seriously interested in reaching a negotiated settlement with the United States. Iran helped the United States topple the Taliban in the fall of 2001 by providing advice on targets to strike in Afghanistan, facilitating U.S. cooperation with the Northern Alliance, and helping with search and rescue missions. After the war, Tehran helped Washington put a friendly government in place in Kabul. At the same time, Iran's President Khatami made it clear once again that he wanted to improve relations with the United States and saw events in Afghanistan as a major step in that direction. As was the case in the 1990s, there was substantial support within the CIA and the State Department for taking Khatami at his word and attempting to normalize relations with Tehran. The neoconservatives, inside and outside of the administration, however, vehemently opposed that idea. They favored getting tough with Iran, and they carried the day with Bush and Cheney. In his State of the Union address in late January 2002, the president rewarded Iran for its cooperation in Afghanistan by including it in the infamous axis of evil. Moreover, Bush made it clear in the following months that although he was preoccupied with regime change in Iraq, he would eventually turn to Iran and try to topple that government as well. Despite America's hostility, Iran tried again in the spring of 2003, as it had in 1997 during the Clinton administration, to reach out to the United States. Khatami said he was willing to negotiate on Iran's nuclear program so that it would be readily transparent that there are no Iranian endeavors to develop or possess WMD. Regarding terrorism, he said that Iran would end any material support to Palestinian opposition groups, Hamas, Jihad, etc., and put pressure on these organizations to stop violent action against civilians within Israel's 1967 borders. On Hezbollah, Iran's goal would be to make it a mere political organization within Lebanon. Khatami also indicated acceptance of the 2002 Saudi peace initiative, which he made clear meant acceptance of a two-state solution. Plus, Iran would help stabilize Iraq. In return, Khatami wanted the United States to remove Iran from the axis of evil and take away the threat to use military force against his country. Sanctions also had to go, and Iran wanted full access to peaceful nuclear technology. In essence, Khatami was pushing forward a solution that had all the ingredients of a grand bargain. Iran's offer was presented in May 2003, just after the United States appeared to have scored a stunning victory in Iraq, on the heels of what seemed to be a stunning victory in Afghanistan. At that point, many people believed that the United States might actually be able to reorder the entire Middle East. It was, in fact, an ideal time to push Tehran to cut a deal, because U.S. prestige and leverage were at their peak, and Iran's sense of vulnerability was acute. Unfortunately, America's favorable position made Bush more inclined to dictate rather than deal. Not only was Israel pressing the Bush administration hard at that point to take aim at Iran, but so were the neoconservatives and others in the lobby. Bush paid hardly any attention to Khatami's offer to negotiate a comprehensive settlement between Iran and the United States, and U.S. officials were ordered not to pursue it. One cannot know whether a grand bargain would have been struck had the Bush administration pursued these opportunities. There were still plenty of Iranian hardliners who would have resisted making any kind of deal with the Great Satan. Nevertheless, Bush was foolish not to try to reach an agreement with Khatami, if only because that approach was the least bad option. Trying to cut a deal might well have prevented the election of President Ahmadinejad, whose irresponsible statements and bellicose attitude have made a difficult situation worse. And if engagement had failed and Iran ultimately acquired nuclear weapons, the United States could still fall back on a strategy of deterrence. It may not be too late to strike a deal with Iran, although the chances of achieving success are less likely now than in either 2001 or 2003. Not only has America's bargaining position been eroded by events in Iraq, but Iranian leaders have more reason than ever not to trust Bush. Furthermore, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has replaced Khatami as Iran's president, and he has shown little interest in reaching out to the Bush administration. Nonetheless, there are still compelling reasons to pursue a grand bargain. Not only is it still the best strategy for stopping Iran from acquiring a nuclear arsenal, but the United States needs Iran's help to rescue the situation in Afghanistan as well as Iraq. This is why the Iraq Study Group recommended in December 2006 that President Bush negotiate with Iran rather than confront it. Its members understood that confronting Iran, as the Bush administration has done in the past, gives it powerful incentives to meddle in Afghanistan and Iraq, which is definitely not in America's interest. There is actually substantial support within the United States for engaging Iran in serious negotiations. As noted, many in the CIA, the State Department, and the military would back the idea. A poll taken in late November 2006, just before the Iraq Study Group released its report, found that 75% of Americans believe that the United States should deal with the government of Iran primarily by trying to build better relations. Only 22% favor pressuring it with implied threats that the U.S. may use military force. The recommendation to engage Iran from the Iraq Study Group, a bipartisan committee of prominent individuals, is another indicator of the breadth of support for negotiations. Even Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, who is usually attuned to Israel's concerns, remarked in early 2007 that Iran is a natural ally of the United States. Although it makes good strategic sense for the United States to pursue a grand bargain with Iran, and although there is plenty of support for that policy inside and outside of America, it is unlikely to happen anytime soon. Israel and the lobby will almost certainly try to thwart any efforts to seriously engage Iran before they get started, as they have consistently done since 1993. Indeed, the lobby has gone out of its way to undermine the Iraq Study Group's recommendation that the Bush administration negotiate with Iran. The release of the report, according to the foreword, has produced an outpouring of protest from Jewish groups opposing its call for talks with Iran, Syria, and the Palestinians. Nevertheless, insiders say that the real target of Israel's anxiety is neither Syria nor the Palestinians, but Iran and its nuclear program. The lobby is also likely to try to make sure that the United States continues to threaten Iran with military strikes unless it abandons its nuclear enrichment program. Given that this threat has not worked in the past and is unlikely to work in the future, some of Israel's American backers, especially the Neoconservatives, will continue to call for the United States to carry out the threat. Although there is still some chance that President Bush will decide to attack Iran before he leaves office, it is impossible to know for sure. There is also some possibility, given the inflexible rhetoric of the presidential candidates, that his successor will do so, particularly if Iran gets closer to developing weapons and if hardliners there continue to predominate. If the United States does launch such an attack, it will be doing so in part on Israel's behalf, and the lobby would bear significant responsibility for having pushed this dangerous policy. And it would not be in America's national interest. Conclusion. As with U.S. policy toward the Palestinians, the tragic decision to invade Iraq, and the confrontational approach to Syria, the Israel lobby's influence on American policy toward Iran has been harmful to the national interests. By opposing any détente between Iran and the United States, much less cooperation, the lobby has also strengthened Iran's hardliners, thereby making Israel's security problems worse. But its negative impact does not stop there. The lobby's influence during the 2006 war in Lebanon also did considerable harm to both the United States and to Israel, as the next chapter will show. Chapter 11. The Lobby and the Second Lebanon War. In the summer of 2006, Israel fought a 34-day war against Lebanon. On July 12, Hezbollah, the Shia organization that controls the southern part of Lebanon, made a cross-border raid that killed and captured several Israeli soldiers. In response, the Israel Defense Forces launched a major air campaign in Lebanon, which killed more than 1,100 Lebanese, most of whom were civilians, and roughly a third of whom were children. It also did extensive damage to Lebanon's infrastructure, including roads, bridges, office buildings, apartment buildings, gas stations, factories, water pumping stations, airport runways, homes, and supermarkets. Although virtually no one challenged Israel's right to respond to the raid or to defend itself, its excessive response was widely condemned around the globe. Despite strong support from the United States, Israel failed to achieve its military or political objectives, and Hezbollah emerged from the war with its popularity and prestige significantly enhanced. The IDF's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Dan Halutz, resigned a few months later, and an official Israeli government investigation chaired by former Supreme Court Justice Eliyahu Winograd, subsequently issued a scathing assessment of Israel's planning and handling of the war. In particular, the Winograd Commission found that Israel's leaders had failed to consider the whole range of options, failed to adapt the military way of operations and its goals to the reality on the ground, and pursued goals that were not clear and could not be achieved. The war was also a major setback for the United States. It weakened the Sinora government in Beirut, whose election after the Cedar Revolution of 2005 had been one of the few successes in the Bush administration's Middle East policy. The war also solidified the informal alliance among Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran, and intensified anti-American attitudes throughout the region, thereby undermining the war on terror and complicating U.S. efforts to forge a regional consensus on Iraq and Iran. How did this happen? Although primary responsibility for mishandling the war lies with Israel's leaders, the United States encouraged their mistakes by offering them unconditional support before and during the war. Israel had briefed the Bush administration on its plans to go after Hezbollah well before the war began on July 12, and was given a tacit green light by Washington. Unlike the rest of the world, including virtually all the major democracies, the United States did not criticize Israel's actions during the war and gave it valuable diplomatic and military backing instead. The Israel lobby worked throughout the war to keep the United States in Israel's corner. It did not make strategic sense for the Bush administration to back Israel's disproportionate response to Hezbollah's provocations, and there was also no compelling moral case for supporting Israel's conduct. America's uncritical backing was not in Israel's interest either. As the Winograd report suggests, Israel would have been much better off if its leaders had examined the whole range of options. In other words, the United States would have been a better ally if it had urged a different course of action when Israel first outlined its plan to attack Lebanon. Had the United States done so, Israel would have been forced to come up with a smarter response and might have avoided the debacle that subsequently befell it in Lebanon. Israelis and many of their American supporters do not want to admit that the lobby heavily influenced U.S. policy both before and during the Second Lebanon War, and they offer several alternative explanations designed to counter this charge. As is the case in other contexts, some defenders argue that the U.S. government's unflinching support for Israel's assault reflects the American public's deep commitment to the Jewish state. The American people, in this view, wanted U.S. leaders to back Israel to the hilt, and so President Bush and the Congress were simply bowing to the will of the people. Others claim that Israel was acting as America's client state in its war with Hezbollah. According to this version of events, the Bush administration was the driving force behind the war, and it got its loyal Israeli client to do its bidding. These alternative explanations might seem intuitively plausible to some observers, but neither is consistent with the available evidence.